Alright, hello everybody. So I want to start out today by appealing, or I was going to say praying, but I guess just appealing to the spirit of our ancestors, right? The God of our ancestors, that is Jesus Christ, of course, the Holy Spirit, and God the Father. Okay, okay, and I want to start out every video from here on out, maybe with that introduction or just with that in mind, because I don't believe any of our current problems, just based off how bad things are going, that they really can be addressed by anything other than a direct appeal to heaven. Now, to move on to the topic of today, I was really, or have been sort of struck by a lot of discussions going on the internet, from the emergence of the woke right to the idea of Jewish theories in general. And I guess I started to come to the conclusion a while back that none of these ideas really mesh really well together with Burkeanism. And of course, I think that that's a problem not only for me, but for broader civilization, when I have a genuine conviction that the only real way forward is through Burkean philosophy. That is, that the only way to truly overcome modernity is through enshrining Burkeanism. And any philosophy which should try to undermine that or to put it on the back burner is essentially attempting to propagate modernity. Now, I started to come to the conclusion a while back that none of these ideas really mesh. The first instance in which I thought that Burkeanism and the Jewish question did not mesh well together would be in the very language of the Jewish question, right? You begin to see it historiographically pop up in German, right? The Judenfrage. Now, the problem that I saw initially with this is that the Jewish question, philologically, it bears all the markers of modernity essentially, and of the recent French Revolution, and that makes a lot of sense, right? The entire early 1800s in continental Europe was an enterprise in deciphering why the revolution had even taken place. And so it makes sense that stewing in those consequences, of course, any latent sentiment concerning the citizenship status of Jews would be filtered through the precedent of the French Revolution. And so you see in the early writings of the Jewish question, for example, or writings which concern the Jewish question, the perennial leftist sentiment that everything is really about power, right? In fact, the Jewish question itself enshrines a notion of power that only really started to crop up again philologically during the French Enlightenment itself. Every writing from the French Enlightenment comes across as having in mind in the language, right, the notion that everything is essentially a conspiracy theory. And that makes sense, right? Because if everything is really about power, then functionally everything is a conspiracy theory. You don't actually need to appeal to any evidence or any philosophy, rather. You can just begin to see conspiracy everywhere. And you get this from Voltaire to Rousseau. And when discussions in the 1790s started to pop up about the citizenship question, right, of Jews, in the aftermath of that, essentially the only way that the question is filtered out is through the very same language of conspiracy and power. And I guess the problem with that from a Burkean perspective is that everything is predictable in the sense that you can trace it back historically, and in doing so, ground yourself in such a way that you can actually see forward and you can orient your civilization forward, right? One of the other ways I should mention is more relating to Christendom, right? Is the Burkean idea of continuity and of precedent, and how that's tied to legitimacy, right? So the idea being that if something happened in our history, then of course it is a part of our history, and to sever ourselves away from that obviously causes alienation. So this becomes very prominent, of course, when you reach back all the way to, I suppose, to the biblical era, in which you stop really being able to appeal to documents that your own ancestors would have readily appealed to. John Locke, for example, or Edmund Burke himself would have made no distinction between the Old and New Testament. They would quote it in their work prolifically. They wouldn't have any compunctions about adding or citing from the Old Testament or the New Testament. And that makes sense, right? When you look at the biblical narrative, the only thing that the New Testament has to work off of narratively is the Old Testament. And I guess the problem is when you sever that link and you prevent people nowadays from being able to trace their lineage back there spiritually, you consign the country to essentially just being either a plot of land or a sort of kennel club, like I said in my substack. So in any permutation, the experiment of your civilization is purely or sheerly material. The spiritual is precluded by that notion of never being able to appeal to the ancient. And that, of course, would have been a huge problem for Burke. Of course, he supported the American Revolution on the basis that we should let the Americans, the colonies, right, remain in their ancient state. And that's a direct quote from Edmund Burke, right? So the very idea of continuity is itself severed several ways, actually, by various Jewish question narratives that exist nowadays, right? So for starters, the Catholic narrative, of course, severs history in several ways. At times, it doesn't let you appeal to the Old Testament. At times, it doesn't let you appeal to certain saints. You can only appeal to Irenaeus for certain things, but you can't appeal to him for other things, right? And to presuppose sort of discontinuity by the existence of whatever monk or cleric throughout the centuries might have alluded to an undercutting, like, Martin Luther, for example, an undercutting of the continuity of Western civilization back to Mount Sinai or to Abraham or even to the garden, result in the severing, of course, of that discontinuity. And it of course results from a civilizational perspective, and from the perspective of the Anglo psyche, it results in alienation. Essentially, you can no longer move forward because you don't actually know what your ancestors were motivated by. So you can't be their spirit and not assist you, and neither can the spirit of their ancestors before them, right? So because the spirit is itself transcendent, in other words, You have to appeal to a spirit so you can actually be an animated civilization. And in doing so, of course, you tie yourself to a legitimate tradition. So I guess those are my basic thoughts on the matter. If Jewish narratives being centered around power sever you from the ability to connect yourself to the spirit of your ancestors, then they're not genuinely conservative. Of course, they're not genuinely right wing, whatever that would mean. And in my mind, most importantly, they're not genuinely Burkean. And that's what matters. So I guess there's the opposite problem, of course, where beyond not being genuinely Burkean, they also forward the modern psyche, right? I guess if anyone has any qualms with this, maybe it might ruffle some feathers, I don't know. But either way, just in the name of Christ, I still appeal to you, and I still care about everyone, no matter if you believe in this. And I guess it's for that matter that I even made the video to begin with. If you have any questions or any arguments to the contrary, I would like to hear them in the comments. And let me know if you want me to make any other videos elaborating on this matter further, or if you simply have any ideas concerning history or politics or anything like that. Tell me in the comments below. I'll be reading them. And I guess I'll see you tomorrow or some other day.